And so those are examples of water plants. And the other one is a water plant that remember that need to be served so that we can actually be able to store water for a longer period. As mentioned, on Kenya, the glacier has been receding, and one of the strategies is to try and attack afforestation activities around the mountain. And this is supposed to be done both within the national park and outside the national park, because the more the park has more forested areas and the areas around the national park, outside the national park do not have any forest, the communities end up coming into the parks. And so one of the ways to actually encourage the communities to ensure that they can actually have their own woodlots for firewood and for the other users is to encourage more afforestation outside the national parks. The other one is restoration of the Relevance and bushland in Amboseli. You can see in the picture below here, this is what was just done in one of the enclosures. Just by doing one enclosure, and within 1 year, you can see from the picture at the top and the one at the bottom, there's significant change within a very short period of time. And so if we do this and we also extend this to the outside community areas, we hope we will actually get more of the forests and more trees outside the park. And of course, these are good colleagues. Mike is here, he was visiting us. And then of course, management of invasive species. This is a big challenge for us. And every time we approach invasive species in the parks, they still grow outside the community areas, and when it rains, it's still carried back into the park. So again, working with the communities to try and clear the invasive species. Again, just seeing at this picture, on top of that was Lantana Camara, so much of it that the one that access the areas, and then of course they can't, of course, they don't eat the Lantana Camara, so then of course they have to go outside the protected areas to look for food. And you can see, just by doing that clearing, the undergrowths on their own start coming up. Then finally, it's conservation education and public awareness. What we're seeking to do is engage communities and talk to them about the importance of conservation and climate change adaptation, and for them to, for example, the invasive species, so that they know what are the invasive species, because one of the challenges is in some of our areas, people get flowers in form of invasive species and they don't know. So again, they keep, and you know, there's something about invasive species about their ability to colonize areas. And so how do we encourage the communities to be able to know the invasive species and get rid of them? So what are our short-term results? Of course, that our important wetlands shall be restored, and there is enough water available for local communities and our wildlife. And then the visitors get informed about our protected areas and help people to adapt to climate change. In the long term, of course, which is critical to us, is the ecological integrity of the ecosystems and our protected areas is actually restored. Then the livelihood of the communities around these areas is improved through better access to water and reduce the human-wildlife conflict for the same. And then local communities and visitors understand and support the protected areas in contributing to the well-being of the people and climate. Some of our learnings, engaging the communities around national parks has actually given us all-inclusive gains. And then, of course, balancing between scientific knowledge and traditional knowledge, which supports better approaches to adaptation work. And then integrating education and conservation activity, which leads to better understanding. And then, of course, finally sharing the best practices with the like-minded partners, both locally and internationally. And just as we've learned from our friends from Mexico, UNESCO and Colombia. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Edwin. Can I ask everyone to join me to thank all the speakers for putting together what I see as an excellent set of presentations and really set us up for our discussion. So thank you very much for that. Okay, we're into the conversation part of the workshop, and to stimulate the discussion, we have two questions that we would really like to see your input into. First of all, from your experience, what are the key barriers for us as organizations and governments to mainstream protected areas in climate change responses? What are some of the best practices for us to overcome these barriers? And third and lastly, we're seeking your members' support for Motion 112. So without further ado, I'd like to open up the floor for your questions or your comments in this session. See that?
I don't know if these have to be on or if I can just move the room if they're not on.
Thanks. In Lee Welling's presentation, she showed in the U.S. a specific example of building this into an adaptive model. And I think this is going to be critical to this because these are all experiments. We don't know exactly if the restoration of the springs and saddle will work or not. So I'd be interested to hear how much Colombia and Mexico and Kenya have built in an adaptive approach and which requires monitoring into that, and how important they think that is in the overall mainstreaming of these restoration projects.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Perhaps we can use that second microphone and pass it around to you.
Yes, at least in Mexico, one of the challenges is time. We're starting with adaptation strategies right now in order to achieve the venue of those. But we're talking about 1 year, 2 years. So unfortunately, although we are implementing the adaptation strategy, it will take 10 years or more, or 5 years to know the impact of that adaptation strategy. But as shown, the adaptation programs have an adaptive management over the year. So yes, we're monitoring the activities, but still it's too early to know if those adaptation strategies are heading in the right direction or not.
In the question of if it is important to us, yes, very important. And I find that two difficulties. One is money, because restoration costs a lot. And the other one is time. I agree, it's time. But we have identified where to restore, where to enlarge the protected areas, or where to make connectivity, which in theory we think it should work. But I agree, we shall see. We don't have this it for sure.
Just as has been said, of course, there is time, but we have the privilege to have tried some pilots essentially for restoration work. For the enclosures, especially in Amboseli, we've actually seen the enclosures begin to work. And the areas where we previously saw wildlife moving outside the protected areas, we certainly see the wildlife inside the protected area during the entire period of the year. And that for us, that is a significant gain. Again, in Amboseli, we've seen where there was so much invasive species. In the last 1 year, we've been clearing the invasive species. And the last animal count that was actually done, the number of wildlife had increased. Now, looking at that and looking at one of our biggest challenges in human-wildlife conflict, competing for pasture, then we see that the communities that live around the parks are starting to benefit because the wildlife then don't go outside the national park. But in terms of the restoration, for example, in Samo, Silver Springs, that is something that will require a bit of time for us to be able to see.
Are there any other comments or views on the presentations?
Thank you very much for excellent presentations. Penelope Figgis, I'm the director of the Australian National Committee. I'm just curious, really to ask the Canadians, because I got the impression that your government is beginning to see it as a mainstream part of trying to change policy. And in our country, I think we've struggled a little bit. I think we're getting there, but a lot of the NGOs actually were pushing deep cuts in energy policy. You know, climate change was all about energy policy, and it was actually quite hard to get the NGO movement, the environmental NGO movement, pushing hard on the role of ecosystems and biodiversity in climate change. So I'm sort of just curious, in a way, to get a comment around the politics of how did you shift that so that people talked about energy policy, transport policy, and the natural environment.
I think maybe we're in the very early stages. I mean, to suggest that our government is adopting a natural solutions approach and it's going beyond where we really are. I think we're at the point where the language is starting to make its way into strategies, reports, and it's being understood. We've got there in part by collaborating, as I was saying, by having a common voice with our partners in North America, by having a common voice with our colleagues in Canada across the protected areas community, by listening to each other and being evidence-based by making sure that what we're saying is based on facts, that we're not stretching beyond what we really understand. And I think those arguments then become not arguments but truths. And it's a gradual process, and we're definitely in the early stages, but I think there's an appetite for that understanding.
Yeah, to add to that, I think the real key is the fact that governments, both federal, in our case, federal, provincial, and territorial, are coming to realizations the relevance of protected areas in this really global issue that's going to be with us for a very long time. And as Karen presented, we have the agreement with the Canadian Parks Council to again move ahead in a consistent manner in terms of implementing these natural solution principles. And we also heard from our partners, Kenya and Colombia and Mexico, where the government of Canada is also making contributions to some of the international climate change adaptation work. So.
Just in case I was being unfair to the Australian government, by the way, there is a $1 billion carbon and biodiversity fund, which came out at the same time as we found the carbon price through. So it's not like they're not doing anything. I'm going to say that for my government friends get cross with me.
I'm not sure if it's a barrier. What I did from where I was sitting was a lot of the interventions were business as usual. the things we need to do as protected area managers in any case. What I was looking for really in a way is what are the extra things that really deal with climate change as an intervention. We've been working in the Pacific at the moment with the Pacific Regional Environment Program. We've just done a workshop with a climate change, UNDP funded climate change project. And we really wrestled during the analysis of the sites we were working on to find out what is different. So that's one comment. The other comment is that the sort of ongoing, what I've seen in many parts of the Pacific is that the ongoing anthropogenic impacts on the environment are being almost sidelined by the emphasis of the impact of climate change that we're going to have in the next 3, 4, 5 decades. And the here and now is being carefully forgotten about in many places. And that's a real concern because that's what we're living with in most of many of the Pacific communities.
Captain.
I knew you'd be argumentative, Bruce. But I actually think that your argument about these are things that we should be doing anyway is a valid argument. But what climate change is allowing us to do is to highlight the fact that we should be doing it and to get on and do it. A lot of these things are good conservation practice. What Kenya is doing about invasive alien species, for instance, is crucially important, but has been very much neglected actually in protected area management practice up until now. If climate change is now putting the spotlight on that issue for a variety of reasons, that's great, it's good for conservation, but it's also good for land management. And I think that applies right across the board with the connectivity arguments, with the expanding protected areas. And I liked very much the way the Kenya colleagues presented this idea of protected areas as buffers for people, because I think that's true. So the climate change dilemma really helps us to improve conservation practice and make better arguments for protected areas and better arguments for doing what we should be doing. I think that's good, I guess.
Would you like to add to that, Andrew?
Yep. It's not an answer, it's also something that we've reflected on. In the process of implementing what we're doing, we're also facing the challenges that our policy instruments are very strict. A decree in particular is fixed in the territory, and now, for instance, we're seeing in Mexico that the monarch butterfly colonies are starting to move, but the tree is static. The management program is static on the territory. So through what we're doing, we're starting to learn that we have to adapt in a very creative and innovative way our policy instruments in order to face these new challenges that we are having right now. So I think it is a learning process, but in order as Kathy was saying, doing the right things, you start to see the new opportunities that are opening, and adapting our policy instruments, our federal instruments, is one of the key challenges, at least in Mexico.
If I can add a final comment on that. In Canada, there's a new strategy being developed called the National Conservation Plan. And within that, there are really 3 key elements, and one is, which is relevant to our conversation here. One of the elements is we need to protect. So in areas where you have climate change impacts and there's an opportunity to establish new protected areas, let's protect those sensitive ecosystems. The second element is to connect, and as we saw in many of these presentations, where there are opportunities to connect ecosystems, and let's again use natural solutions to focus on those important areas for this connection. And the last one, I think we've highlighted in all these presentations, is the key role of restoration, how restoration can in fact increase the resilience of these ecosystems. So protecting, connecting, and restoring. These are things we sometimes do on a regular basis anyways, but I think natural solutions really highlights again the relevance of these for protected areas. I think we have a question right there.
Well, maybe not so much a question, but speaking really on Kenya, I come from Zimbabwe, and I think what hasn't really been touched on, we're looking and focusing on protected areas, but what happens is poverty is very high in developing countries, and the impact on protected areas is enormous. So what we're doing is working around protected areas, uplifting the livelihoods of communities, and I think that is a critical part of climate change adaptation to assist protected areas, because we're focusing on projects like beekeeping, and a lot of this is now protecting the trees and also stop fires, because they don't want. We've had cases now where communities are going out and putting out fires in areas which never happened before.
Any final? Okay, we have a question over here.